wise is to become the religion of the many. It is needed as a motive for the majority of human beings to move toward moral and spiritual improvement and health, since relatively few attain in this life to a pure love of God above all things. Leibniz clearly believed that these benefits depend greatly on established religious institutions to interpret God's will with the aid of established doctrines about God's particular dealings with human beings. I believe that this is a major motive of Leibniz's theological conservatism, his reluctance to abandon doctrines established in a sufficiently wide range of Christian churches. According to the Theodicy, doctrines that deserve this trust must be grounded in a revelation that has sufficient proofs or motives of credibility. These will largely be scripturally attested miracles connected with the historic giving of the revelation. Another motive of credibility that Leibniz mentions elsewhere is the holiness of the doctrine. Leibniz argues that even though doctrines of revealed religion established in this way have only moral certainty, it is rational to refuse to abandon any of them unless an objection to the doctrine is proved with metaphysical certainty. I believe the rationality thus affirmed by Leibniz must be understood as practical. This is not to say that the doctrines defended in this way are all exclusively ethical precepts and other directly practical applications. On the contrary, Leibniz vigorously defended doctrines of revealed theology of highly theoretical content, such as those of Christology and the doctrine of the Trinity. These considerations may facilitate our understanding of the modality of Leibniz's acceptance of the doctrine of eternal punishment. With that in mind, I will examine just two more texts. In January 1695, Leibniz wrote a letter to one Lawrence Hertel, in which he said about the rival doctrine of universal salvation, quote 22, "All that can be said about it is that it would be true if it were possible, and if divine justice could allow it. But as we do not know the depths of the divine justice, it is safer not to advance opinions which are not soundly established and can be harmful since they are capable of keeping sinners in their security." Against the background of his epistemology, I think it is fair to say that in this text, Leibniz grants that he does not know whether all humans or all rational creatures will be saved in the end or not. Given his insistence that sinful acts of creatures are in the strictest sense contingent, and that eternal punishment depends on eternal sinning, he certainly has reason to believe that he is not metaphysically certain that any sinful creature will never repent and be saved. But he argues that it is practically unwise to adopt universalism because we can foresee moral and spiritual harm that might result from it, and because it is not ecclesiastically established as a revealed doctrine as the rival doctrine of eternal punishment is. I believe that much the same stance is expressed, less fully but more elegantly, in a phrase that can be viewed as crowning the Theodicy's discussions of this subject. Quote 23, "God having revealed to us what is needed for fearing the greatest of evils, and not what is needed for understanding it." Here again, knowledge is denied, and a practical spiritual advantage is claimed for belief in eternal punishment, or perhaps more precisely and more cautiously, for fearing it. This does not mean that Leibniz could not sincerely profess belief in eternal punishment. I assume that he was sincerely committed to speak and more generally to act on the assumption that the doctrine is true, and that he sincerely regarded the doctrine as having at least the minimum theoretical probability required to sustain such a commitment to a practically advantageous proposition. Given his epistemology, what more, by way of sincerity of belief, can we reasonably expect of him? Personally, in conclusion, I believe that Leibniz was terribly mistaken about the alleged moral and spiritual advantages of accepting the doctrine of eternal punishment. And of the main practical concerns that shaped his theodicy, fear or caution about disturbing established institutions is a very questionable spiritual guide for people who live in a time in which established religious institutions have been disturbed and will be disturbed. Leibniz's conception of a piety of loving God as a way of blessedness is, I think, of much more permanent interest. I believe it is also the part of his Theodicy that Leibniz himself cared the most about.
Okay, thanks. We started 10 minutes late, so maybe we'll go 10 minutes late if there are questions. So please go to the microphone there.
So I just want to make a comment, particularly concerning your very last conclusion, that you wouldn't agree with Leibniz about the eternal punishment, relating that to your earlier remarks about Lessing and Eberhard. I just want to say you kind of compromise the two guys together as softening the traditional dogma of eternal punishment. And I would rather say that Lessing was in that debate with Eberhard. Lessing actually published that writing for the first time after 100 years. It was no longer available in Germany, not even in the Latin edition. So what he did is he published Leibniz's defense of the eternal punishment. And then he awaited the protest of German theologians. And he published it particularly in order to provoke the pietist, enlightened theologians at the university at Halle, like Semler, who is pretty popular still in the American theology today. So Semler didn't answer himself, but some other people instead of him, and Eberhard was one of them, to argue that Leibniz wouldn't be so inhuman, etc., etc. So Eberhard was very much in the opinion of you that he wouldn't accept that dogma, because it is not human, right? So Lessing took rather the totally different position. So he was not softening Leibniz at all. He rather took the very orthodox position, but it was written at the time, something like 8 years before he was announced as a Spinozist. So in that respect, really context plays a role. So Lessing didn't really want to say that is true. He rather wanted to provoke the enlightened theologians who wanted to soften that Christian dogma. And Lessing just said, no, that's a Christian dogma. Either you are a Christian, then you have to accept that, or you are not, and then you rather become a Spinozist.
Well, that's very likely true about Lessing's deepest motives. I didn't mean to be commenting on his deepest motives. I meant to be commenting on the content of his essay, which I take to be a brilliant essay. It's very well worth reading, whatever one takes Lessing's motives to have been. And taking his essay at face value, it's not that he's primarily, I mean, I agree with you, he's undoubtedly, by the 1670s, he's taking a view that is hard, I mean, he's pushing in the paper a view that is harder line than a group of influential people that no doubt he was trying to provoke. They might not have been the only ones he was interested in provoking, but they were certainly among them. My comment was simple, I mean, what I meant was simply, look, yes, Lessing argues and gets Eberhard to agree that, yes, Leibniz did endorse the doctrine of eternal punishment, but then as one sees how that doctrine plays out, and, you know, if you imagine Calvin reading those essays, if he had read them carefully, he would say, this is a wimpy doctrine of eternal punishment, it's a work of Satan. Because of the way in which the intensity of the punishment is minimized by both authors. Yeah.
Anya, were you? Yeah.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Yep.
I didn't want to cause a confusion.
Sorry. Yeah.
This is just a very small question about the account of where the love of God comes from. So if I understood that correctly, so there was this question, so why would the knowledge of the perfection give rise to the love of God? And the story was that knowing the perfection